Hello and welcome, everybody. It's great to see so many of you here. It's great when people turn up to things, so thank you for doing that. It feels great. Welcome to another JST Conversations discussion, new wine in old wineskins. Albeit less so than our European counterparts. Britain has, I would say, a thriving history of interacting with the canon, taking old pieces and redoing them. A very, very famous playwright famously said that Britain was being infected with radical European stagings of classic text. And he blamed it all on a very, very, very bad man called Ivo van Hove. I'm personally a big fan of Ivo. It's his words, not mine. But he really laid the blame at his feet. Perhaps that sort of European Ivo-esque style of interacting with the canon represents one end of the spectrum of what one finds in the British landscape, wherein texts are transported from one context to another. The original intentions of the author, the way in which it was done in its own time is seen as nothing more than the starting point for negotiation. Texts are updated, texts are made to speak to now, made to be relevant. Texts are transformed as such, which sort of elevates the role of the director, much to the behest of that very, very famous playwright who should not be named. Google him, you'll find him. But one also finds within the British landscape something very different, something that's perhaps more traditional, one in which there is a presumption that the text is already inherently a thing, and then the work is really to sort of seek that out and present it. Today, with three of Britain's foremost adapters, interpreters, we're going to be exploring what adaptation is. First of all, why do it? Why go back to this old canon of plays? Why not just do new plays? And if we do them, how should we do them? Should they be made to speak to now? Should they be made to be relevant and urgent? Or is that a nonsensical European convention? Perhaps British theatre needs its own Brexit. Very quickly before we begin, why are we having this conversation? So we have a show on right now called Orlando. It is in itself an adaptation of a classic piece. So we thought, well, we better bring the audience back to have a conversation about adapting classic pieces. And lo and behold, here you are in great numbers. A few bits of housekeeping. Each speaker will speak for a little bit on their own for about 4 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to an informal discussion between you and them. You'll be able to ask questions. I will try and get through as many questions as possible, which might mean I have to be a bit strict with the length of responses, but as ever with these things, time is of the essence. Mind also that there are cameras around. We will be filming, we will be putting it on YouTube. So without further ado, we shall begin. I'd love to introduce our first speaker. Simon Stephens is one of Britain's foremost playwrights. We haven't had the good fortune of having one of his plays on here yet, but who knows what the future holds. But his plays have been performed at many of Britain's top playhouses, including the Royal Court, the National Theatre, and the West End, regularly all over Europe. And he's also a professor of writing at Manchester Metropolitan University. Over to you, Simon.
6 years ago, I was in the toilet of the National Theatre during the interval of the previews of my version of Brecht, Weil and Hauptmann's Threepenny Opera. And usually, for a gents' toilet, a conversation was taking place. Two gentlemen who appeared to be in their 60s were washing their hands. One turned to the other and said, "Well, I suppose you prefer your Brecht in the German, of course." There was a sense in his tone which seemed to imply something. The notion of a new translation of such an august masterpiece as the Threepenny Opera was an act of a kind of betrayal. That the experience of that formerly groundbreaking collaboration could only be diluted by translation, and this dilution could only be dampened further by any attempt to present the text as being in any sense contemporary. They were hankering for the original. What baffled me about the comment is the idea that it's predicated on the possibility of there ever being any kind of theatrical production that is in any sense possibly presented, that could any sense possibly present such a hypothetical original. I spent time today trying to imagine what the purest original version of any play, let's say for the sake of speaking, the Threepenny Opera could be. Would it be closer to the original if the translation was built on the closest linguistic translation available from the source language? But languages don't translate closely onto one another. This is why actors rarely, if ever, perform literal or accurate translations. The ruptures and structures of different language create sentences which, if translated accurately, would make little sense and certainly lack rhythmic energy. The literal translation of the opening of the song Mac the Knife, which I think is precise, is, "And the shark, he has teeth, and he wears them on his face. And McKeith, he has a knife, but the knife no one can see." Now, that might be close to the original, but it's not very singable. The Threepenny Opera is an attempt to capture the musicality of street language. To insist that this can only be captured with accurate translation would seem, ironically, to betray the original idea in the first place. And even if the production was staged in German, well, languages, even languages like German, shift over time. So sentences spoken in Germany in 2022 are very different to those spoken in 1929, which is why Threepenny Opera is rarely staged in Germany nowadays. Do we honour a linguistic precision or interpret the authorial intention? And similarly with design or staging ideas or approaches to acting or form, would the only acceptable version of Orlando in this theatre be a kind of group reading? Because in form that was originally a novel. To stage the Threepenny Opera as exactly as Brett would have staged it would be to turn it into a living artefact for a museum. Playwrights want their plays in theatres, not in museums. I go to the museum to have my curiosity piqued and horizons opened. I go to the theatre to have my heart broken and my head kicked in. There's no such thing as an original version of a piece of theatre in the way that there may be an original recording of a song or an original painting. Theatre is the art of interpretation. We as audience members interpret the performer's interpretation of a director's interpretation of a source material, refracted by an artistic team's interpretation of those same ideas. It's in the matrix of interpretation that the possibility of its force lies. It's what makes it the most human and collaborative of all art forms. It's that matrix that allows its whole to be more than the sum of its constituent parts. For what it's worth, we went with "See a shark's teeth flash like diamonds, shine and sparkle in the night, but McKeith wears just a switchblade and he keeps it out of sight." Nice.
Thank you so much, Simon. Our second speaker will be Zoe Svensden. Zoe is a director. She's a lecturer in drama and performance at the University of Cambridge, where she's doing pioneering work on the subject of dramaturgy. Over to you, Zoe.
Thank you. I don't know how pioneering this is going to seem. Anyway, in fact, it's all about there being nothing new. So it's just like in my 4 minutes, I just wanted to sort of think about three thoughts. The first is that there is nothing new anyway, and it's a peculiar quality of Western thought in general and our culture in particular that we always talk about new writing and new plays and the new. And we think of originality as being something where there is no origin, in fact, that it's come out of nowhere. And marketing is all over that, right? The next, all about the next big thing. Whereas I don't think there's anything that I've made across my career where I couldn't kind of trace back pretty much exactly where I took bits and pieces from and amalgamated them together, whether I'm making kind of big interactive participatory pieces of performance or whether I'm dramaturging a Shakespeare. And because there's, I suppose because I've spent quite a lot of time with Renaissance drama and Shakespeare over the past decade, doing, I think like various different kinds of versions, I guess, although no one would necessarily admit that. Like, my name's not on the byline, even though sometimes when reviewers quote Shakespeare, they're really quoting me. They just don't know it. But of course, Shakespeare takes all his stories, or most of his stories. In fact, I'm dramatising The Tempest at the Globe, and we were just talking about how that's one of the few where that's not the case. But I'm also working with Madonna Fellow at the National, and looking at the differences between the source plot and the plot that Shakespeare's put in. It actually tells you something quite useful about what's going on in the play. And depending on how familiar the play was, so we just did Hamlet recently in the Sam Wanamaker Theatre, and of course there was a Hamlet that's got lost. So we think there's a Hamlet with a ghost in it that's pretty similar that was on a few years before. So there's sort of all the source material that aren't plays, and then there's probably a play that he was also doing something in relation to. And then there's all the revenge tragedies that he was doing something in opposition to formally. So I think our idea of newness is a very sort of specific kind of, it's also to do, I think a lot to do with kind of Western culture and ideas about progress and because in many, many other cultures around the world, historically there isn't, like, this idea of new doesn't exist, and knowledge is built out of other forms of knowledge and relations to knowledge that already exist. So there's that. That's probably taken up actually like 3 minutes. I'm doing really fast on my other two. The other thing is, I think the stories, like every time you make a translation, whether that's from page to stage, there is no such thing as a kind of, it's not that there's a play that you could put on and you weren't somehow doing something with it. It's not like, I think, a distinct difference, but also when you do translate from one form to another, from a novel to a stage play, of course you're reimagining, rethinking, and I haven't sadly had the opportunity to see this yet, but I think of Katie Mitchell's The Waves, or her Waves, when I think of Virginia Woolf, and that's a completely different form, but for me it spoke the novel really, really precisely. Many of you probably don't know the piece, but it was done using, it was the first piece that Katie Mitchell did using sort of digital, sort of forensic digital representation, where you saw a composed film whilst watching the actors using Foley and performing below it. So you saw the live composition of the films that was composed. And then finally, is the thing I think is somehow going on in this, and I've only just started to understand this properly, thanks to Karen Cooper at the Globe, who's writing a book called The Great White Bard, about looking at the colonial era and the way that Shakespeare was kind of enshrined in the culture. So I've always been kind of confused by the decided ambivalence of critics generally, and audiences sometimes as well, about when you put on a Shakespeare and you're making it work. I don't really think in terms of words like relevance so much as actually how does this speak and what's it trying to say and what the character, like just doing the play. But my version of doing the play often results in like phrases like iconoclastic, or like trying to break the play, or like, not, we're trying to do the play. Because like the more I understand Shakespeare's era, they were working playwrights who were working together. They're changing things, they're writing for particular actors. There's loads of different versions of the plays because they're doing things differently at different times. But we have this literary culture that goes, here's this sort of perfect genius, idea of the genius. You can't be better than Shakespeare, is a sort of phrase that often gets said, as though when you're staging Shakespeare, you would try and be better than it if you actually try and make a scene work in that moment with those actors in that particular context. And I sort of never really understood this until this conversation, several conversations with Farah recently, where she was pointing out that they did a Shakespeare festival, I think, in the 18th century. It's sort of at the point where the British Empire was really getting going, and they were using Shakespeare as the kind of spread of English culture around the world. And in this Shakespeare festival, they didn't put on a single play, and instead they had like a statue of him suddenly looking very classical and not like the geezer that like the original portraits had, where he. So they suddenly they invented a new idea of what Shakespeare was, to produce this kind of literature to bolster the idea of English superiority and therefore to justify empire. So now when I read the reviews that go, how come they did that with da-da-da-da, like some of the Hamlet reviews we got, I'm like, you see the same flow is going through. This idea of this perfection is nothing to do with actually the working practice of with the Hamlet. It was a particularly specific one where we had standing ovations for every show, but like I would say 80% of the critics really didn't like it, and on press it was really clear because the only people sitting down had notebooks on their backpacks. They also didn't say that other people had enjoyed it, which was also like, and so I thought, what's the guardianship of the culture? I think is my question to finish it. Who's guarding a culture that these translations of form are somehow not permitted?
Thank you so much, Zoe. Our final panellist is another of Britain's foremost playwrights, April de Angelis. We've been very fortunate. We have had her work produced here, which has been great, and maybe more in the future.
I didn't know that.
Her work has also been produced at many of Britain's top playhouses, as well as internationally and on the West End. So.
I remember, of course. Yeah. Sorry. So I'm much more like thinking kind of more practically about, why adapt something for the stage from another form, like a novel, because a novel is so different. And you've all read novels and you've all seen plays, and you can sort of, I don't have to go into why. But I've just actually finished an adaptation for a book called, for radio, actually not theatre, called The Convenience Store Woman, which is a really fabulous novel. But it's very interesting because you sort of get your theatre brain head on, and you just go hunting around for scenes, and sort of like, and so you're really making this, there really is something called theatre, and you're really trying to kind of dig it out of a book or a. And I was thinking I've adapted Frankenstein and Wuthering Heights, but they were quite kind of, when I was adapting Wuthering Heights, the director at Birmingham, Rachel Kavanagh, said, just don't muck around with it too much. I was like, okay, fine, I don't mind. And actually, there is a way in which you sort of go, well, Emily Bronte, is a genius. What am I going to bring to Wuthering Heights that is better than a genius did? And the same in a way with Frankenstein. Both these women, these young women, amazingly, Mary Shelley was 18 when she wrote Frankenstein, and Emily Bronte was 28 when she wrote Wuthering Heights. It's sort of, you're not going to better them, but having said that, you are also, what has to go on the stage has to be work on the stage. You can't have a warmed up novel on the stage, so you can't just sit here, as Simon said, you sit around reading the play. It's not like that. But at the same time, I very rarely see adaptations that I like, weirdly, because I think they weren't born for the theatre, do you know what I mean? You're always struggling against a form that was never really conceived to be put on a stage, if you're talking about putting a novel on the stage. Having said that, I really did love Orlando, which I saw, but I thought really fascinatingly, the scene that I found most powerful and worked incredibly well for me, and I sort of thought shone out, was the scene where Orlando has gone from he to she, but it's her first time, and so she has this dress on, she's in a scene with a guy, and she's working out how do I perform being a woman? What is this thing? And her performance, it's you're reading her trying to perform a woman, not getting it right quite, and it's really shows you the performativity of femininity sort of thing. And it's made for theatre. Theatre's made for that. It's made for kind of looking at the roles that, looking at what a role is, a role that someone's being forced to play or perform. Think of plays where people are in disguise, or they're misidentified, and that theatre loves that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's. And I suppose my only other point was it's okay to do anything on the theatre that you want to do anyway. So there's no really, do you know what I mean? Just do it. If you want to do it, go for it and do what you like. But there is a kind of, and I suppose when I say put Frankenstein on this thing, you could set it in a pole dancing class in 2010 or something. But you think, well, why not just write a play about that? Do you know what I mean? There's a sort of pivot, isn't there? How much do you push something away from its intention? But of course you can if you want. If Frankenstein's gonna, do it. I think that's hard. That's me.
Brilliant. I'll just ask the first question, and then it will be over to you. So I guess my first question is, why do it? You know, the two of you are playwrights who write fantastic new plays. What is the point in going back to this old canon of stuff?
Do you want to do that, Simon? What is the point, Simon?
The only thing that I will answer the question, and I'm trying to answer it briefly, but the only thing I'd love to kind of clarify before is, for me, in my head, there's a difference between what I always describe as writing a version and describe as making an adaptation. Because for me, it's the process of, say, adapting The Curious Incident, The Dog in the Nighttime onto the stage, or Blindness onto the sound and light installation and the stage, was different to writing a version of, say, The Cherry Orchard or The Seagull or Throughout the Opera. On one, I'm working from a source material that's in a different form, a novel in both those occasions, and adapting it for performance. And then the other, I'm taking a play which is written in a different language, it's not English, and writing it into English. And I guess in the end, the only point for me is because I just really would want to see them. Like the only reason I write any play is because I wish somebody else had written it so that I could watch it. And when I read The Cherry Orchard, it, as I said in my little provocation or whatever, it breaks my heart and it kind of kicks my head in. And I want to do that to other people and find a way of doing it that has a kind of resonance and a contemporaneity that makes them think not about what life was like in Russia at the turn of the 20th century, but what they are like as human beings. They recognise themselves in it. And I don't adapt like all novels, but there are some novels where I find there's a kind of a dramatic impulse at the heart of it that I want to see crystallised. Like The Curious Incident, I just wanted to see what his dad was like, and I wanted to see what his mum was like, because in the novel, the way the novel's written is he doesn't release that constellation to the reader, and I wanted to explore that. So I write them because I want to see them. I think.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose when I adapted My Brilliant Friend just during the pandemic at the National, that was 4 massive books, but the reason that you have to find a reason to do it. So the first reason it's a job and somebody obviously should do it. So there's an economic imperative, to put on things that people know. They know the story is a good story and audiences have recognition about it, so they'll come. And that is one reason why I get a lot of adaptations, because it's not as risky as new work. And that's slightly worrying in a way. But the reason that I liked My Brilliant Friend was because it had 2 female protagonists, working class Italian young women born just after the war, and it was an epic story. So I put these 2 women in the heart of an epic story about the history of Italy, the history of the mafia, the history of Italy and feminism, and it just put them in the middle of this story. And I thought, when does that ever happen? And how brilliant to see it on stage. So that was my justification, if you like, for doing it. So, I think that's what
The
I
other
say.
thing, sorry,
No,
we should answer questions as well. No, because what you prompted me to remember is one of the things that I love doing it as an artist is, like, as playwrights, most of the time we're living in our own imagination.
Yeah.
But if we do a version of a play or we do an adaptation of a novel, for a period of time, we get to live in another writer's head.
Yes, that's true.
And that's just really beautiful. And I think it nourishes us when it comes to making more original work. Having spent time with Chekhov or with Mark Hadlin or Stephen King or whatever, then that makes me want to write more of my original work, I think.
And you don't feel impeded in your natural intention to sort of address things going on now by the fact that these plays are from contexts very different now.
Well, you presume that there's something in the story that has resonance for now. I mean, everything. I mean, if you're as a reader now reading any text, it's going to have a resonance for now anyway, in a way, isn't it? So because you're reading it now.
So I think the good stories are like kind of constellations that hold something up to view or make you really feel something in a particular way. And they almost like even the Greeks were writing plays out, you know, the first sort of plays, dramas, were out of other stories and legends. Right? So there's an impetus to kind of take something where you really feel something because of the constellation of the way something's set up. I always feel like they hold pain onto view, the tragedies hold pain onto view in this incredible way, and they don't resolve it, but they hold it in a way that means you see yourself in it, or you recognise something about your life. So in a way, the distance in terms of time doesn't matter because it gets into the core of something, and I think there's always then an impulse to reimagine and recreate and rethink. Like I was saying, I don't think there's anything new anyway. I don't think there's this bigger distance between the adaptation of something and the creating of something that hasn't existed before as what's called, in terms of what's called a new play. I mean, I haven't ever written a completely new play. So I mean, I'm just like, but I've made things actually that are completely new. Actually, it's not quite true. I've made like interactive performance things that have lots of writing in them. But I feel like the structure might be different, everything, but the stories and the things we understand, or the moments in your life that you feel you need to unpack there. I'd say there's less distance than we make out in our theatre structure.
So interesting. Let's take a question. Sky.
I was just wondering, have you ever worked in the room with the person that wrote the novel or the piece, like that they wrote the first, piece that you are basing your story on? And how, if you have, how has that relationship worked between, say, novelist, theatre writer, and then actors, or have you been in a room like that? And how that?
Have you?
Yeah, I have.
Go on, because I haven't.
Well, Mark Haddon, who wrote the novel The Curious Incident of Love at the Night Time, I knew him before I made the adaptation. And we spent time together just because we liked each other. We were both on attachment at the National Theatre Studio at the same time, and we kind of gravitated towards one another because we had children a similar age, and kind of same taste in music, and we started hanging out a bit. And it was a couple of years after being friends that he asked me to make the adaptation. He was, I have to say, exemplary. I absolutely loved working with him. He'd written for theatre himself, so he could have made the adaptation himself. He always says the reason that he didn't comes from the same place as the reason that surgeons are not allowed to operate on members of their own family, because he's too close to the material to kind of do it with any kind of objectivity. And he asked me to adapt it. He said because he knew my plays were really dark and violent, and he was worried with Curious Incident that people would make an adaptation that sentimentalised Christopher and kind of made the questions in that book, resolved the questions in that book with too much optimism. And he didn't think I would do that. And then kind of having asked me, he was brilliant. He kind of said, look, whenever you want to ask me a question, just call me and I'll answer straight away and answer anything you want to ask. But if you don't want to ask me a question, don't ask me a question. Just get on with it. And he did both of those things with great generosity. He read first drafts and gave really good notes. And I think for a novelist to have written a book that's as successful as that, and it was profoundly successful, it becomes a bit of an albatross. So that every time he wrote a new book or wrote a new story or wrote a TV play or a stage play, people wanted to ask him about Curious Incident, and he said he'd fallen out of love with it. And so the experience of him coming to the first read-through at the National Theatre and then the first preview at the National Theatre, and watching him kind of leap around like an excited puppy and then cry because he said he'd fallen back in love with Christopher again and fallen back in love with the novel. So really one of the highlights of my working life was that friendship and that collaboration. I'm working on another adaptation of his at the moment, and we'll see if it goes as well. He was very generous. He was really generous.
Hey, April, did you want to speak to
Oh
him?
no, I haven't.
Oh, it's okay, no, that's fine. Another question.
I'm glad you mentioned the ancient Greeks, and you spoke about doing your head in, breaking your heart, pity and fear. Is there any such thing as progress in the theatre? Is it the same story with different clothes? Or is there an essential shift? I'm sorry this is a bit philosophical. I'm not part of the theatre community, but I wish I was.
Great question.
We're looking to Zoe.
I mean, I don't know how to answer it really, because maybe, I mean, I when I look at my work, which spans really, really different worlds, I can see myself coming back to the same. I wonder if as humans we all have our obsessions that we come back to. So particular stories speak to us in particular ways, and then we're trying to work things out through that, and that's been going on through history. I mean, when I started to understand a little bit more about theatre history, I was like, oh, like I think me and my mates, in our early 20s, we think we're inventing this, but actually they invented it in the 80s, and then before that they invented it in the 60s, and then before that they invented it in the 30s. And actually, all of our, the theatre loves to be new because it's sort of part of the ta-da, and so we all play on that a little bit in a way that's kind of cheeky and also a little bit untrue. So I'm not sure I'm answering, but like, I don't know whether I'd call it the same old story so much as like, the question of what does it mean to be alive and how do we get through it is one that I think the theatre is at the heart of all what theatre is, and that's why maybe the stories that really speak to that keep returning to us as things we want to work on.
I don't know about what progress means in anything.
Especially at the moment.
The notion of progress seems to have been kind of carved out of the same moment that you're talking about the kind of Shakespearean festival that doesn't have anything so messy as a play in it. We I don't know if we're progressing as a race at all or a species at all. We just keep doing the same old shit again and again, and maybe the reason we return to the same old stories again and again is because we keep making the same mistakes. The plays help us make sense of the mistakes. I don't know, you look as though you're...
No, I'm just thinking, oh God.
And also, we are capable of the same beauty as well. We keep falling in love. We keep kind of somehow raising children, and they're kind of often they're better than we are. And those ancient plays carry optimism as much as they carry despair as well.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because there's the reason I'm sort of unsure about words like relevance is when you're asked to justify why you're doing something now, it often gets very thin because I think it comes back to those core things. Whereas of course you do find yourself seeing something through the lens of the times that you're in. Like when we were doing Hamlet, I couldn't help thinking about how like Hamlet's like this weird kind of, he's like all of us right now. We know the climate crisis is happening and it's about to engulf us, and we know that we've got some kind of cultural relation to it that means that we ought to do something about it. But first of all, we sort of deny it's happening, and then we go, well, maybe it's happening. And it's like, let's put on a play to see if it's happening or not. And then it's like, oh no, now I know it's happening, so I'm going to do something. Oh, but then if I do that might not work. So maybe I should do this. So we move from sort of denial to delaying, and we're like, well, but I don't know who I'd be if I did. Who am I? And then you spend a long time. Hamlet spends a long time talking in Hamlet, even in the version that I edited. And then they all die because by the time he gets around to doing anything, he kills the wrong person. We're constantly right now looking at the wrong things. Like we're all I'm doing lots of stuff around sort of theatre and climate and dramaturgy and stories and how we tell them. And then I read today about there's something like 195 new oil and gas projects about to start up that are just going to take us over 1.5 degrees like that. And you jolted into, what's the point? And then you get a bit Hamlet and go back to your talking again. What's the point?
And you blame your parents.
Exactly. And then, with Hamlet, you wouldn't have had any sense that Hamlet had anything to do with the climate crisis when you went to see it. So I think the making it relevant would have been to sort of make it obviously that. But for me, it really spoke to, it made me go, look, we've all been like this all along, and we don't know what to do, so we just keep talking instead. I suppose I'd sort of see it that we're just trying to keep going in a state of uncertainty and unknownness.
So for you, it's less about a particular adaptation speaking very specifically to a topic, but a kind of these natural resonances that almost happen by accident and may happen or may not. Is that fair to say? Or?
Well, I think it just depends, because I think it depends on the person doing the adaptation and why and what for. But I also mean what might drive you to do an adaptation of something, or make a piece of work might be something like I'm saying about Hamlet and the climate crisis. Might not be visible in it, but it's still the driving. It's the sort of motor of. I mean, I've just done an adaptation of my first actual proper adaptation of the novel of the Maltese Falcon for the stage. I'm just finishing it at the moment, and the driver of that is like, because I don't know if you know, but if you know, you probably know the film rather than it's a famous 40s noir rather than the novel. They're pretty similar, but basically the driver is that the detective is supposed to find out who killed his business partner and spends all of his, like pretty much the whole time going after the money, like trying to work out where this Maltese Falcon is supposed to be very precious is and who's got it, and keeping it away from the gangsters and the baddies. And it turns out, spoiler alert, to be a fake. And you kind of go, well, that's another kind of like, I think the drive for me is like, that's where we're at now. We keep like going after the wrong stuff, the stuff that doesn't matter. I don't think if that adaptation ever reaches the stage, there's going to be anything that's like directly, obviously, that in terms of what people see. But I think then the motive for doing it, like you were saying about the young Italian, like you get a motive, don't you, for why something needs to be said, and it may be something. There's a great Andre Gide quote, but I don't know where it came. I have no idea where I got it from. I magpied it from somewhere. But he says, everything that was ever worth saying has already been said, but since no one was listening, you have to say it. I've just paraphrased that really badly, but yeah.
Brilliant. Let's take another question, please.
I want to ask the panel about the best adaptation they think they've seen. I mean, what prompted it was I went to see To Kill a Mockingbird, which is a really interesting way to adapt a book by just taking part of it, the court scene, which is innately theatrical anyway, in a courtroom, and taking that as the sort of the heart of the presentation of the book, and building around the backstory around that. And I was very impressed with the way Sorkin handled it. It's one of the best adaptations I personally feel that I've seen. Not everybody agrees. I wanted to ask the panel what the best adaptations they think they've seen.
I think there's a belligerent part of me, and I'm not sure if it's an adaptation. So you might push back on me and say that's not an adaptation, Simon. But I partly want to big up Ivo van Hove and say that the Roman Tragedies, which is an assimilation or a version or an update or an adaptation of 3 Shakespearean plays, is, in my opinion, not only the best Shakespeare I've ever seen, but I'd probably put it, if somebody forced me to choose the best theatre I've ever seen, it may well be that, I think. I don't know if that's an adaptation
of a novel.
It's not an adaptation of a novel, no. So I'm cheating. But I feel like April should have a go. While they're answering, I'll think of an adaptation or a film or something.
I actually can't think of
I think I mentioned Katie Mitchell's Waves already. That really stuck in mind because I haven't always got on particularly well with Virginia Woolf, but I felt like something about the forensic kind of precision that in that form really really matched that writing in a brilliant way without just redoing it for the stage. I'm not sure otherwise. There's a wonderful book called Alone in Berlin that a friend of mine, Belgian director, adapted for the stage in Germany. That was really extraordinary. But yeah.
Rob Ike's 1984. I thought that was absolutely extraordinary. Yeah, that's a book. That was definitely a book. Rob Ike and Duncan Macmillan, to be fair, to give the playwright the due.
And what was so special about that production for you?
I thought there was a rigour in both the political and psychological analysis that was coupled with a fearlessness in the theatrical imagination and a nuance and detail in the acting. I saw it in London and I saw it on Broadway as well. And there was something genuinely terrifying about walking out of the production in Broadway in 2018, I think, to go into Times Square, which was Times Square of Trump's presidency, and the kind of like the combination of, unbridled capitalism at a time of genuinely terrifying, legislative control, that felt as though I'd walked out of a staging of 1984 into kind of living 1984. And it's very rare that any piece of theatre has felt so politically resonant, but that really, really did, I think.
It was great, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was really good.
And for me, the other thing about Kill a Mockingbird was how relevant it made something written, in the 30s, and brings it in with all the Black Lives Matter and it just rang a lot of bells for me in the way that he was able to bring some of the current thinking out through this. But there are, we've all seen bad ones as well, things that absolutely fall flat as a pancake. So, you've got to go see a lot of theatre to work out what it is that works and what doesn't.
Great. Should we take another question? Hello.
Hi. I went to see a show recently called Octorin in the Abbey in Dublin, and it was kind of like a new playwright had taken an old text and changed the narrative.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you were all to take a piece, a classical text, and change the narrative, what would it be?
That's fun.
Gosh. It's like work. It's like my work. I've got an idea for this, but I'll come back to you. No, I saw Octorin, and I thought it was really a very fascinating piece of work. Let me think. I can't think of something.
One of the things I'm working on at the moment is which is a reimagining of The Tempest. Because I think Shakespeare's not that good, so I probably need a contemporary playwright to teach them some lessons about exposition and things like that. I think it's an absolutely extraordinary play, and it's not about repairing it. Somebody said, I don't know if you've had this with TV or film, that people sometimes, when you go for television or film and you're asked to adapt a novel, the advice I was given was you should adapt something that you think isn't very good, so that you can make it better for screen or television. And I think that's really specious advice. I think if you're going to make an adaptation, you've got to live with it for months or years. So I think you should make something rather than to correct it or repair it. You make something because you love it so deeply. You want to share your love with it with other people. And I think in the end, the thing about The Tempest that fascinates me is I think it's the strangest, most deranged imagination, and it's often presented as being a kind of perfect example of Elizabethan thought or Jacobean thought, but it's madness. And I wanted to really investigate the madness in it. But so for me, I wouldn't want to repair something or spend time with something that was broken. I just kind of it's like when Rob does The Wild Duck or something. That doesn't feel like a correction to The Wild Duck. It feels like he's sticking his hand in and cherishing and releasing his heart. So I do that with plays that I love, I don't know. Fun.
Well, I mean, I have to say that 80% of adaptations go to men and 20% go to women. So as an adapter, you were working in a context of sexism in that way, because women perhaps aren't seen as trustworthy with classic texts. I think that must be what it is, and that this is a figure from the Arts Council. So I mean, it's interesting that I have tend to work with female authors when all of the people that I've adapted, actually, even the novel this was a Japanese writer, brilliant novel I just done for the radio. They're by women writers, and somehow you're allowed to do those. But they're brilliant anyway. Women are brilliant writers. Yeah.
Speaking of Rob Icke, I wonder if you could speak a little bit about working with directors and I guess the process of creating an adaptation, because so much of what you said, Simon, was about the directorial vision as well, and what part does that have to play in adaptation? What's your part as a writer versus a director's part?
No,
go on.
No, you. Yeah.
No, go on.
All right.
Please, this is fine.
I don't know about you. I think with my original plays, not just adaptations, that I really celebrate and lean into the notion that a production of theatre is, in the end, it's the director's production. And it might be the director's production of my play, or it might be the director's production of my adaptation, or my version of another play, or something from another form. But whether it's working with Sarah Frankham doing Like Falls at the Royal Exchange, or Sean Holmes doing Fortune in Tokyo, or Marion Elliott doing The Curious Incident, or Walter Meyer Johann doing Blindness, or whatever, for me, it's not that it's my play and my play is precious and needs to be protected, or it's my adaptation. For me, it's always about collaboration, and I really celebrate the notion that a director is an artist, actually, and profoundly disagree with Sir David Hare. This might not be him, but he said things like that to me. It was him, yeah. I just think he's wrong. I think he's wrong. And I love David as a human and as an artist, but I think on this question he's wrong. That what makes theatre a live art form is its collaboration. So I lean into that, I think. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think with Mary Still when I was working with them. I mean, we work together a lot. So you know, when you see something on its feet, it must be the same. I mean, you're both in a way, aren't you? Director and writer.
I suppose, yeah.
Yeah, which is really interesting. Yeah. So you can add that perspective. But you know, you see a play on a scene, say, on its feet the first time, and then you understand it. It's only in a sense, and then I would sort of talk about what worked and what didn't, and then that was it's very interesting, especially in translation when you're trying to leave one form behind to get into another form, and I found that really enjoyable and collaborative, and yeah, it was great.
Yeah, I don't, because when I'm directing, it's highly collaborative endeavour. But I don't think I've worked with a one writer so much as well. It's not exactly devised work, it's often quite technological, but lots of different people at different stages through one kind of process. And then with dramaturging, the writers I've worked with as dramaturg are all dead, so I haven't had to deal with the realities of a person who might disagree with you. But that makes it sound like I'm solo, which I'm not, because I first got into that role of working sort of dramaturgically. Because a director, Joe Hill-Gibbons, asked me to come and work with him on something, because I think it was an RSC workshop to start with, and then we were asked to do the Changeling at the Young Vic, and it was a bit like, what's the process by which we work with these plays, and how do we work out how to understand them, and what do you do? So we sort of worked through a whole kind of, so it was sort of deep, like I suppose deeply collaborative, because we did a sort of whole thing. We were like moving things around and changing things, and the show was successful. And then it had been on in the studio, the Maria at Young Vic, and then it wasn't just a remake; it was a kind of new production of it, but basically the same production. In the following autumn, in the main house, and I went back to the text in between to see what we'd done, because when doing that work, we never go back and go, what did they? We just keep moving and trying to understand. It's a process of trying to understand something. And then I had a look at it and was like, that's really funny. We ended up putting all the scenes back in the same order that we had them originally, apart from one thing. And so, but by then we knew what it was there for, why, and understood it. So I feel like I'm always interested in to go to the theatre and see how someone sees the world. And I suppose that is often the director, because they are always interpreting and translating and imagining with the actors in a collaborative mode, but holding the reins of that collaboration with all of the different voices that they're bringing together. And if there isn't someone or I mean, like when I'm dramaturging, I guess it's sort of I'm kind of working with the director. I'm not sort of supporting their vision so much as like just like in there working, if that makes sense, like just getting on with trying to work out how to do it or what it should be and how to keep the ideas alive and how to work with those particular actors, rather than because I don't think you can have someone else's vision in your head, or you can have this conversation, and the conversation where you disagree is as productive as the conversations where you do agree, constantly trying to find the best thing for the work. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question very well, but I think directors are important to that process, and when they're sensitive to it, it's the best. Like the work I grew up on in a way, because I first lived in Berlin when I was 19. There's all like extraordinary like stuff at work in Berlin, and that's sort of known for being sort of director's theatre. And then later I'd go back and sometimes see something, and I was like, oh, I know what director's theatre is now. They've copied that amazing person I saw like 5 or 6 years ago and their work, and they're like layering over a bunch of images to kind of break the play or something. So it's some ways of working became fashionable, but then sort of go. So I can see there's a version of it that is problematic when it hasn't got heart. But if actually the reason you're making decisions with your actors in the room about a text in a particular way is because you're trying to find what the essence of that thing is, that might lead you really far. And generally in the rest of Europe, that takes a group of people further when they're making a piece of work than it does here. But it's partly because we have much shorter rehearsal periods, partly because we do have a writing culture, right, where you write a play and then it gets put on, rather than take something and like wrestle with it for, you need longer basically than our process generally allows if you're really going to get inside something and open it up properly. So yeah, I think there's a sort of tendency here towards not doing that, partly because it's a dangerous thing to do. You have to do it really rigorously, like we've been talking about. And if you don't have much time, then you tend to go, let's stick with what we know works.
And I wish we also had.
We did work on a project that didn't come to fruition, called Helen. It's about Euripides' play about Helen of Troy. But in this version, Helen says, it wasn't me that went to Troy, it wasn't me that went off with Menelaus, it was a ghost. And I was just shoved on this island. And like we were interrogating this and thinking, well, maybe she has sort of, she has she's disassociated from her own body because she's been raped. We were talking about, that was one of the thoughts that we had. And so that was a really interesting, back to your question I didn't answer, that would have been a really interesting text to kind of pull apart and interrogate. But it didn't go, did it? But it was fun.
It was fun to do.
Yeah, really interesting thought, thinking around.
Brilliant. We're going to have to stop things there. We need longer rehearsal periods, we need longer sessions for this. But constantly disappointed. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. Thank you so much for being such a fantastic panel. The reason why we have to stop now is because we have to get ready for the show this evening. That show is Orlando. If you haven't seen it yet, please do come. You'll have a really great time. If you're about to see it tonight, you're in for a real treat. It's a wonderfully acted production directed by my predecessor here, Stella Powell-Jones. So hope to see you all again soon. Thank you very much. And